Welcome to Healthy Minds. I'm Dr. Jeff Borenstein. Everyone is touched by psychiatric conditions, either themselves or a loved one. Do not suffer in silence. With help, there is hope. Today on Healthy Minds,
I think we're just at the very beginning of being able to use TMS and some of these other kinds of non-invasive technologies to get in and change the brain in wonderful ways, to treat diseases and potentially do much more. Maybe we should step back a second and talk about what are the chances of people getting better. So in people who are treatment resistant, who've tried and failed 2 medications, I think about it in terms of a rule of thirds. So out of 100 patients in that class who come in and get TMS for the 6 weeks, about 1/3 will get remission. That means their depression is totally gone. Their symptoms are gone. There's no real depression measurable at that moment.
that's today on Healthy Minds. This program is brought to you in part by the American Psychiatric Association Foundation, the John and Polly Sparks Foundation, and the New York State Office of Mental Health. Welcome to Healthy Minds. I'm Dr. Jeff Borenstein. Can a magnet help treat depression and other psychiatric conditions? Today I speak with Dr. Mark George, a pioneer in the development of the use of transcranial magnetic stimulation in the treatment of depression. Mark, welcome to Healthy Minds. Thank you for joining us.
Oh, thanks for having me here.
I'd like to start off with you giving an overview. What is transcranial magnetic stimulation?
Transcranial magnetic stimulation, or as we call it, TMS, the acronym, it's a relatively new technology. It's been FDA approved now for about a decade, used primarily to treat depression. But fundamentally, it involves taking an electromagnet, which is about the size of your fist, so a piece of metal really, surrounded by copper wires that are insulated, and then passing electricity through that and putting that near your, resting it on your skull. As you may know, there's electricity and there's magnetic forces. Whenever electricity flows, there's magnetic fields around them, and a rapidly changing electrical field will produce a magnetic field. Now, electricity, if it goes onto my head, will stop. Skull and skin or resistors.
Doesn't get through to the brain.
Doesn't get through. Whereas magnetic fields pass totally unimpeded. So the magnetic fields actually go into the brain, and because they're very powerful magnetic fields, about 3 Tesla, which is about an MRI scanner, but very brief, as that magnetic field passes into the brain, it encounters a nerve cell, and a nerve cell is just like a piece of copper wire. It actually then, it becomes depolarized. Electricity gets generated in the nerve cells. So what we're doing is we're taking electrical energy, turning it into magnetic energy, using that trick to pass through the skull, and then it encounters the brain and actually non-invasively stimulates the surface of the brain, the superficial parts of the brain. So I call it electrode-less electrical stimulation to remind us that we're actually electrically stimulating the brain. We're just using the magnetic field as a trick to get through the skull. So in an awake, alert person like myself, we can actually, for the first time ever, get in and stimulate the brain and then see what happens when we do that.
So it's FDA approved for depression. Tell me a little bit about how it works.
So fundamentally, it actually works by stimulating the brain. So one of the revolutions that's occurred in the past 20 years, it's not really a revolution, it's a re-remembering, is that the brain is actually an electrochemical organ. With all of the wonders of pharmacology, we really focused on the brain as kind of a chemical organ. But we forgot that each and every nerve sends electrical impulses to the synapse, and then it releases a neurotransmitter. So all of the neurotransmitters, norepinephrine, dopamine, all of those transmitters really are doing nothing but modulating electrical signals in the brain. And so the revolution that's happening along with TMS is this re-remembrance that the brain is an electrochemical organ, and that the currency of the brain really is electricity. So if you rethink that, then if we can begin to talk directly to the brain in the brain's language. And that's what TMS fundamentally is doing, is actually stimulating non-invasively parts of the brain. So it is FDA approved for a couple of indications. We can talk about those, but I think we're just at the very beginning of being able to use TMS and some of these other kinds of non-invasive technologies to get in and change the brain in wonderful ways, to treat diseases and potentially do much more. So how is it actually doing? It's causing nerve cells to depolarize, which is what they do all day long, all the time. While I'm talking with you, I've got trillions of nerve cells depolarizing. So it's doing that, and then that's causing a release of neurotransmitters. With TMS as a treatment for a disease, we have to stimulate repeatedly. A 30-minute session a day, every weekday for 4 to 6 weeks is the FDA-approved indication. And so what's happening over those repeated sessions is we think that, and my theory when I developed it, was that we're actually changing the way different parts of the brain relate to each other. And that's being confirmed now with advanced neuroimaging, where we're actually showing that this part of the brain that we're stimulating directly, the prefrontal cortex, is actually getting stronger in terms of its ability to govern and modulate other parts of the brain, the limbic system, which is kind of where our emotional life bubbles up from. And so that was kind of the theory that I had way back when, was that in depression, this cortical governance wasn't working quite right, and that if we could essentially non-invasively, without causing a seizure, stimulate, we would re-strengthen these circuits.
It's almost like resetting these circuits so that the person's depression can lift.
Yes, I kind of think about it like going to the gym and doing reps. And we do 3,000 pulses in a session. So it's every day when a patient comes and sits in the chair, they get 3,000 reps of this part of the brain saying to the emotional part of the brain, get in line, do what you're supposed to do. One way to think about the prefrontal cortex and the limbic relationship, we just know it's not working when people are depressed. So if I'm walking down the hall outside my office and a colleague looks at me the wrong way, I'll note it, I'll think about it, and then I'll have like 15 different potential explanations for what's going on, right? Maybe they're having a bad day. What do I know about them? What about their family, One of which is maybe I did something to get them angry. And another one of which is I might be a bad person. But if you talk to anybody who's depressed, that same interaction, walking down the hall, a colleague, there's only one explanation, and that is
blame themselves.
That they're bad and that they've done something to hurt that person. So what I'm able to do when I'm healthy is my cortex can generate all these flexible solutions and then, and then prioritize. Should I go back and talk to that person now or next time I see them? And the cortex is constantly helping us survive the bumps of life. And in depression, it's not flexible. It's not doing its job. And somehow with TMS, repeatedly stimulating that part of the brain, 3,000 reps per day over 6 weeks, that part of the brain gradually gets strong again. And we're able to actually now measure and look at, just like if you go to the gym, you can measure the size of your muscles, we're able to look at the size of those connections, and we are regrowing those parts of the brain, which is really phenomenal. I didn't think that we'd actually be able to image and see what we're doing, but it's true, we are.
Tell me about any side effects that people may experience with this process.
Well, the nice thing about TMS is you just sit in a chair, a little bit more comfortable than this one. It's a dental chair. There's no IVs. You can eat anything you want beforehand. You can do anything you want beforehand. You don't have to be NPO or nothing by mouth. And you can do anything during the treatment. You can listen to music. You can talk to the doc or the therapist. The actual stimulation itself stimulates the superficial muscles of the scalp. There's some muscles right on your scalp. And so it's not pleasant. It feels kind of like somebody's tapping on your head, hard eraser. But only 1% of patients really find it uncomfortable enough to where they have to either stop or slow down. So it's a little bit painful for the first couple of sessions. After that, people get quite used to it. It's a little loud, so sometimes people wear earbuds. The main concern, although it's extremely rare, is that if you stimulate a part of the brain too much, then that part of the brain gets excited, it talks to its neighbors and says, hey, hey, come party with me, and you can get an unintended seizure. And there have been about 500 of those in the world's use of TMS over the last 25, 30 years. The good thing is that when that happens, it always happens during the stimulation. So when you're in the chair with the nurse right beside you, never happens in the drive to or from the office or when you're up on a ladder. And all of the seizures that have occurred have been self-limited. That is, they've stopped on their own, so they haven't required IV medication, and no one's ever had any sequelae or problems from that accidental seizure. We now understand kind of the unsafe ways of stimulating that are more likely to cause a seizure. So it's a rare event, 500 total.
Out of how many people have...
Well, it's hard to know actually, because there's no way to actually get that information. It's clearly way in the millions in terms of the number of sessions that we've had now. So pretty rare, probably much less likely than just taking some of the antidepressants like nortriptyline. So that's one of the things that we worry about. It's a very rare event. Sometimes in the treatment of depression, we can overshoot a bit. So if somebody has been terribly depressed, their depression will go away and they'll actually get a little bit too excited and start to get a little bit what we call hypomanic. That is, they're not just at their baseline, but they're a little better than that. So they don't need to sleep as much. They may be overly ambitious in terms of what they think they can do. And because it's a daily treatment, the doc and the technician can assess you. And when that happens, what we do is we typically skip a couple of days, hold off on a treatment, make sure somebody sleeps well, and then they typically can then actually go back and continue the course. So what we can get sometimes is a treatment emergent hypomania, but we watch out for that. It's pretty rare, but it happens.
And after the course of treatment, so the person has the treatment, the depression lifts, what happens next?
When we developed TMS, we tried it out largely in people who were what we call treatment-resistant depression. So these are people who've tried a course of talking therapy and have usually tried and failed at least 2 different medication trials. So a trial of, say, Prozac, followed by a trial of some other medication. And so they're treatment-resistant. So, you know, they're not the person with a new depression just off the street.
Other treatments didn't work.
Right.
So now we're going to try this.
Right. In the first studies that we did, we actually took patients off of their antidepressant medications, really to settle the science. So it's not TMS with a medicine, it's just very simple. Does TMS work? What's much more common now is that patients are maintained on their antidepressant. Even if the antidepressant isn't getting someone undepressed, it can often help with sleep or a little bit less anxiety, and so those medicines are maintained. And so after a course of TMS, if someone is on medications, they will be advised to stay on those medications and keep our fingers crossed and see how long they could stay well, assuming they got better. Before we talk about that issue of the durability, how long do people stay well, maybe we should step back a second and talk about what are the chances of people getting better. So in people who are treatment resistant, who've tried and failed 2 medications, and I think about it in terms of a rule of thirds. So out of 100 patients in that class who come in and get TMS for the 6 weeks, about 1/3 will get remission. That means their depression is totally gone. Their symptoms are gone. There's no real depression measurable at that moment. Another 1/3 won't get remission, but they'll get response. So their symptoms are cut in half. If they're crying every day, they're now crying every other day. And then unfortunately, 1/3 it just doesn't work. There are very few, if any, cases where it makes people worse. So that's good. But the chances of getting either a remission or a response are over 50%, and that's good. But if you get a remission or a response, we typically say, let's see how you do, and then if you have a bad day, don't call us. If you have a bad couple of days, think about calling us. If you have a bad week or you know your depression is coming back, come back. And maybe a third of patients will require a booster session sometime within the next 2 years after they're finished. One of the good things that we've discovered is that in those booster sessions, if you responded in the first index case, your chances of re-response are greater than 90%. So once a responder, pretty much always a responder.
So it doesn't wear off in terms of
yeah,
the response with
you
treatment.
don't get tolerant to it, which is very interesting. I mean, I have some ideas about why that might be, but and sometimes if you go back and get the booster session pretty quickly, you don't need the full 6 weeks again. You can respond with a shorter course, maybe 2 to 3 weeks. Now, why that is, I'm not sure. Maybe that the brain's just not used to being ill. Maybe we've actually trained those muscles with using the gym analogy, so that when you go to the gym, you don't have to do as many reps to get the bulk back. I don't know, but you don't need often as much in terms of number of sessions, TMS, in the booster sessions. So the durability is good. It's better than with antidepressants alone, but sometimes people need booster sessions. There are some patients who keep slipping. So they get a response or remission, several months later they need a booster, they go back out, several months later they need another booster. And in those people we start talking about maintenance, where we would set up a schedule where they're going to come by every couple of weeks for 1 or 2 days of TMS. And there are some patients who do well with that. It's an area where we really need a lot more research to figure out what the best dosing schedules are, but sometimes that happens. And it's inconvenient, you have to go get the treatment, but it's not too bad.
It relieves the severe depression.
That's what everyone says.
It's worth doing.
Right.
I want to ask you a little bit about the other conditions that TMS can be useful for. So tell us about that.
TMS was just FDA approved for obsessive-compulsive disorder, which is quite interesting because we've known for a while the circuitry of OCD, obsessive-compulsive disorder. And the interesting thing about the approval of TMS for OCD is that it's not just the stimulation. You have to pair the stimulation with behavior therapy. So what we're learning is that the brain state while you're stimulating actually is really quite important. That you need to manipulate what the brain is doing and then pair that with the brain stimulation, and you can get better clinical effects. So for OCD, you meet with a psychologist or a psychiatrist and come up with a list of your obsessions or compulsions, and then before each treatment you actually are stressed. So if I have a contamination phobia, for example, we would say, well, imagine that you're actually sticking your hand in a sink where
there's a lot of dirty dishes in that sink,
or worse, and then people would rate, well, that really gets me going. That makes me quiet. And you would actually, on purpose, get someone exposed to a certain level and then do the treatment. So the treatment is actually pairing behavior therapy, which I really think is so interesting about brain stimulation. It's not that it's medications or brain stimulation or talking therapy or brain stimulation. What we're finding is actually mixing those things together is really what's required for some of the hard-to-treat illnesses. So OCD, you really do need to combine effective exposure therapy with the TMS in order to get the therapeutic effect. So we have FDA approval now for not just depression, but OCD. And then there are lots of other conditions where we don't yet have FDA approval, but there's a pretty good body of evidence that it might work.
Which ones do you see sort of coming down the path in terms of other conditions?
So one of my jobs now is to be, I'm the editor-in-chief of a journal called Brain Stimulation. So every morning I wake up and I get to see all the work that's going on planet Earth with these tools. And so I feel like I'm at the horse racing, and I can see all these different horses, and your question about what's coming is really looking at that and trying to place a bet. And there are a lot of good horses, and I think they're all going to cross the finish line eventually. But which ones are imminent? I would have to say that it's either chronic pain, where if we stimulate either prefrontally or over motor cortex, we can either acutely treat pain or, for people with chronic pain, help fibromyalgia, there's some good studies. The other area is in the addictions, and there you pair exposure. So you make someone crave their substance and then do the treatment. And there's some large multi-site trials that are ongoing now in smoking cessation, and I'm hopeful.
What should someone do if they're watching this show now and they have depression and maybe other things haven't worked, or maybe they're thinking about what to do next? How does a person go about potentially receiving TMS?
The great news is that they don't need to call me. The reason I'm saying that is that
For many years, you were the place to get it.
well, and the worry is, with some technologies, they may be very complicated, and they are done better by some experts than others. Some surgeries are probably like that. But with TMS, what we were able to do as a field was to find ways of actually locating the spot, and then algorithms that needed to be done, and then train a whole cadre of good psychiatrists to do it. And very interestingly, after the FDA approval, the FDA required some studies to be done in the real world. So not in the ivory tower, but actually out in the real world. What are the response rates? And the numbers that I quoted before, the third, holds for regular psychiatrists out in the regular world. And so I get people emailing me or calling me all the time saying, Dr. George, I want to come, I want to get TMS from you. And what I say is, no, I don't do any better than your local person, and it's always better to sleep in your own bed and pet your dog. So the good news is that in most, even now fairly small towns, there is a TMS provider. What you want to do is, you can just Google it, or it's pretty widely available in most medium to small towns, and you can Google and find a local provider. What you want to know is whether that person has gone and gotten training, and most people have, and have a certificate that they know how to do it.
So you want to make sure that the psychiatrist doing this has had the additional special training, and then you can get this treatment in your local community.
Right, yes. One of the issues is the idea that what I said, the FDA approval is for one treatment a day, 5 days a week with weekends off for 6 weeks. And that's great if you live right next to the hospital. So one of the questions that the field is working on now is, can you move off of that one treatment a day, 5 days a week schedule and still get good results? And the answer is, and this is work that's just been presented in the last year or two, is that you can bunch those treatments. So you can often get 2 treatments one day, stay overnight, get 3 treatments the next day, and you'll get the same effect. The other advance that I really want to talk about is a thing called theta burst, Theta burst. What is theta burst? Well, if I stick a wire into a deep part of the brain called the hippocampus, and I just listen to the neurons firing, kind of like listening for birds chirping, you'll hear neurons talking to other neurons. And the language that they use is a firing frequency that's theta burst. So that's 3 pulses at 50 hertz with a carrier frequency of 5 hertz. That sounds really complicated, but it sounds like this. Brr, brr, brr. And that's just the way the brain talks to itself. And theta burst is extremely powerful at causing circuit changes. It's like a special way to lift at the gym. Cleverly, some people said, what if we do TMS with theta burst? And the thing about it is that the theta burst treatment, rather than a 30-minute session, is only 5 minutes. And instead of 3,000 pulses, it's just 600 pulses. So theta burst is kind of changed. So if you can do it quicker, it should be less expensive and easier to do.
Mark, I want to thank you for the extraordinary work that you've done that has had such an impact for so many people. And thank you for joining us here today.
Thank you very much for having me.
Thanks. Transcranial magnetic stimulation is a new treatment that's helping countless people with depression and other conditions recover. In fact, people who may not respond to other treatments often respond to this new treatment. Remember, with help, there is hope. Do not suffer in silence. With help, there is hope. This program is brought to you in part by the American Psychiatric Association Foundation, the John and Polly Sparks Foundation, and the New York State Office of Mental Health. Remember, with help, there is hope. Until next time, I'm Dr. Jeff Borenstein.